It almost felt like a dream. I woke up to my dog, Lucy, barking. She was upright on the bed where my husband and I were sleeping with our 22-month-old daughter. Staring at our door like an unknown stranger was out there, rummaging around. I thought she was just freaked out over a house noise. We'd only had her for about 3 months and she was still a puppy, so it wasn't too inconceivable. It could have been anything. Our roommate, a creak from the house settling, the awnings moving outside in the breeze. I wasn't too concerned initially. I decided that the best bet would be to open the door and show her nothing was there. It sounds a bit silly, but that's what we do with our daughter when she gets scared, and I figured it should work with a puppy too. I opened the door, and she raced to the front door. She stood there, snarling at the door. It was an angry, violent growl, one I had never heard her make before. I looked groggily at her and opened the baby gate blocking the doorway, planning to open the door and show her everything was fine. The second my hand reached for the deadbolt, Lucy went wild. She started barking and jumping towards me, and when I touched the metal, she suddenly changed her temper. She whimpered, almost like she was afraid of backing down. As her mannerisms changed, so did mine. I wasn't calm anymore. My heart was racing and sinking at the same time. I had been flooded with a mixture of fear and dread. I looked through the peephole. I can't explain why, but I did. Outside were 2 kids. One was just a smidgen shorter than me, and she didn't look much younger. I'm 21, and she looked to be about 16 or 17. She was slender and pale. Her hair was a light shade of honey blonde, and she wore it long, about mid-back, with long, thin, blunt bangs in the front that covered most of her eyes. She wore jeans, a light wash that's popular right now, and a thin-looking olive-colored pullover-style hoodie. She held the hand of a small girl who looked to be around 3 or 4, in the same style jeans and a button-down ivory cardigan. The smaller one was looking at the floor shyly, but had the same shade of hair tied back in a ponytail. She held a stuffed toy under her free arm, and it was identical to one of my daughter has, as was the style of dress. Had it not been for those feelings of overwhelming dread and fear, I probably would have asked these children in, and given them some sort of tea or hot chocolate to get them out of the bitter cold. But something about them seemed off. At this point, I hadn't made any noise, and I hadn't shushed the dog or grumbled, nothing. I hadn't turned on any lights. These kids had no indication I was at the door. The older one spoke. She had a voice that was mature, confident, strong, and accentless. She held her head tilted downward, and I couldn't see her eyes. She said, "We have to use your phone." I stood frozen in fear. How did she know I was there? She raised her head to face me directly, and that was when I saw her eyes. There was a reason I couldn't see them through her bangs before. They were black. She said, "Our mother's worried." As someone who has always been interested in creepy stories, I know what she was the second she looked at me through the door. I had never been one to believe in these things as a staunch atheist and skeptic who comes to the paranormal. I had written off many a ghost story from friends and family, eager to tell their tale. I didn't believe it. Still, I couldn't rationalize my way out of this. I was standing with nothing but a thin wooden door between me and the black-eyed kid. There was no questioning what was right in front of me. I did not answer her. Slowly and silently, I backed away from the door, Lucy still cowering at my ankles. She kept talking. "Let us in to use your phone." I took another step back, and with that step, the tone changed. At first, she seemed polite. When I took that second step back, she became commanding, almost hostile. "We're not going to hurt you. If we wanted to do that, we would have broken in. I'll ask again, may we come in and use your phone?" Lucy snarled at the door, and I inched backward. though something inside me seemed to be slowly pulling me back towards the door. It wasn't a physical pulling so much as a subconscious need to go back and let them in. I got to my room, covering up the window, locked the door, and sat in the dim light of the nightlight. I heard her call me back to the door once more, and then quiet. I didn't go back to sleep that night, and I haven't slept right now. I know from reading about them in the BEKs, they can't just come in without permission. I know they haven't hurt anyone, but I still fear I'll be the exception. When I told my husband, he said it was just a dream. He keeps telling me to forget it, but this lingering feeling of sadness, this dread within the house is silent at night, this fear of a knock at the door. This tells me otherwise.
Reddit No Sleep is an evil place. It is not the writers or the readers, whether they be active or lurkers, but rather something much deeper and darker to which I'm referring. Something demonic. I'll provide a warning right up front to those so inclined so they can leave now. This is a very true recounting of what I believe to be an actual demonic possession, and I firmly believe that somehow reading this subreddit invited this hellish being into our midst. I'll start from the beginning. I first discovered this subreddit late last year. Immediately, I was hooked. Like a junkie to the needle, I returned day after day to get more. I'd sort the content by top votes of all time and read everything I could in the time I had. One day and the next I would narrow it down to the highest rated posts of that week, alternating between those methods, reading and rereading hundreds of stories, sometimes just to try and find subtle nuances in the storytelling. I even wrote a long synopsis on one of my favourite stories a month after it was posted, because it took me that long to fully analyse it. Sometime after I began reading, my wife started complaining that she was feeling a bit off. I didn't think anything of it at the time, beyond perhaps an unseasonal illness, but after a week she began to lose weight, a lot of weight. As her condition worsened, we consulted a physician who told us she was anorexic, although we told him that she was indeed eating. A battery of screenings and tests revealed no other condition, but still she worsened. She became constantly fatigued. Anytime she reclined beyond 90-degree angle, she'd fall asleep. The physician told us that she was not only anorexic, but narcoleptic as well. They put her on prescription stimulants and was scheduled for daily sessions with a psychologist. Things only went downhill from there. I'd wake up in the early hours of the morning, while it's still dark out, to find her on the floor in awkward, contorted poses, usually staring directly at me. Prior to this, my wife was not a flexible woman. She should not have been able to achieve positions that a Bikram yoga instructor would have strived for. More trips to the physician where they said that she's also epileptic, as well as anorexic and narcoleptic. Her midnight contortions actually a form of epileptic seizure. They prescribed more medication to control her seizures, but again, she got no better. In her sessions, she began to lash out at her therapists and doctors. Prior to these events, I had never, and I mean never, heard her utter a swear word in her life, and we've been near lifelong companions. However, during these sessions, it was as if she had become another person. She was then recommended to a psychiatrist, and I knew what that meant. They wanted to drug her. Some kind of mood stabilizers or hormone capsules, probably. And if she didn't show improvement or they deemed her a danger, they would take her away from me, put her in some mental health facility where she'd be given shock therapy treatments or worse. Her and I hadn't had an honest conversation one-on-one about this, so I initiated it. It was then that I realised that this was indeed not my wife. Not all of the time, at least. She had moments of lucidity where she would look at me with the same eyes I knew all my life. But they were fleeting, quickly replaced with the deadness, for a lack of a better word, that had overcome her. She became more violent, and during her outbursts, she began to speak in an octave below her usual voice, and in different languages that she never knew before. I'd hear the snickers from orderlies and nurses at her psych eval appointments about her not needing a shrink, but rather a priest, or worse, a padded room in which to rot. Her doctors began to suspect that she was in fact schizophrenic, and that this was an underlying cause of everything. So they put her on an antipsychotic regimen, but it didn't stop anything. If nothing else, her symptoms were heightened. When we were alone, and she would start in on her rantings and ravings, which I mostly ignored, but one day last week, she caught my attention by talking about themes from stories on No Sleep. She'd say things like, "Can I offer you an orange?" or "There's a nice church in the loop," or "Thank you for calling Booth World." On one occasion, she asked me to be her pen pal, even if she had just read those stories herself. There was no way that she could know that they were my favourites. She'd still occasionally revert to the women I loved, and when she did, she would cry and beg me to help her. She'd say that she knew there was something controlling her, that she wasn't wholly herself anymore. She begged me to have her exorcised, pleaded for a priest, only to change demeanour completely in the middle of her requests, to laugh at the idea of a priest being able to help, sarcastically taunting the idea, telling me that after she was through with her, I would be next, and then the priests and doctors and so on. Eventually, we reached the final straw. We had been sleeping in separate rooms ever since the threats began. At her request, during the moment of lucidity, I rarely slept well, as you can imagine, but on this particular night, I actually did manage to drift off for a while. When I awoke, I was no longer in the room in which I'd fallen asleep, but rather in our bedroom. The entire room was freezing cold, even though the rest of the house was warm, and I was tied to the bed with belts. My wife stood in the corner of the room staring at me. No contorted pose or facial expression, just a blank stare. When she spoke, again in another language, her mouth hardly moved and she just said something I couldn't decipher, but I remember it sounding almost like "Dwasalt nist slap in." And she just repeated it over and over, moving a little closer and getting louder. At first, I thought for sure that she was going to kill me. Maybe choke me to death or stab me or something, but she didn't. She got in the bed and sat, leaning in so close that I could see nothing but her eyes. But they were not her eyes. They burned with hatred for me. Then she simply got up and left the room, leaving me tied there in the bed, the room warming almost immediately. She left me there like that for a long time. I dared not to let myself fall asleep, but I don't think I could if I wanted to, for fear of what would happen if I did. I don't know how long I was tied up, but it had become light and then dark again before she finally re-entered the room. She fell to her knees and sobbed apologetically at what she had done before untying me. I could see in her eyes it was her again. We talked for a solid 20 minutes about the whole thing, and she told me that she could see what she was doing but had no control over it. We debated on whether or not to call a physician or a priest, whether to have her put into a psychiatric facility where she'd get stronger medication and monitoring, nor in the presence of the clergy where she'd get an exorcism. She wanted the latter. I wanted the former. She practically filibustered her stance until I finally agreed on the condition that, regardless of what happens, she seek further help with a facility because, as much as I hated the idea of my wife being away from me, I hated the idea of her in prison for doing something horrible to me, or something even worse. So we set out to find an exorcist, and eventually we did, through an old neighbour who attended a seminary school whilst living in the flat beneath us. He was a hobbled and crotchety old black man with short grey stubble on his head and face. He was blind in one eye and near paralysed on one side due to a stroke suffered nearly a decade before. He was called Cypress. We were told that he only needed to get the name of the demon inside to banish it, so he set out to do his work. The exorcism itself was not at all like what you've seen in the movies. No violent thrashing about, no crawling up the walls or floating over beds. Just words exchanged between the supposed demon inside my wife and Cypress regarding the true nature of good and evil, God and the devil. Those words were often not pleasant, but hardly more unpleasant than any philosophical argument at a pub over a pint or six. There were tense moments in which I was sure violence would erupt, but it never did. Toward the end, they began to speak that other language, with the supposed demon repeating the same phrase to Cypress, which it had repeatedly said to me a few nights before, whilst I was tied to the bed, just before the expression on my wife's face changed to one of utter shock, and she shouted out, in her own voice and tongue, a name I dare not type here. Cypress repeated the name, adding, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I banish you back to hell." A few repeatings of that along with some holy water being tossed about, and the whole thing was done. In the following days, my wife said that she could tell the presence was gone, but she lived up to her end of the bargain and checked in willingly to the psychiatric hospital. During our first day there, I met with Cypress to pay him his fee. He looked absolutely dreadful in appearance, but said he never felt better. He even showed me that he could walk around without his cane and use his entire left side again, just before collapsing onto the ground in an apparent heart attack. The paramedic said he was dead before he hit the floor. The next day, I received word that the original physician who diagnosed my wife with anorexia, narcolepsy and epilepsy and the schizophrenia also died of an apparent heart attack. His colleagues and friends all said that he assured them he'd never felt better in his life, despite his horrid appearance and the hours leading to his death. Despite those unfortunate circumstances, however, today is a happy day. The first in a long time, in fact. For today, my wife comes home. She's regained some weight, is sleeping through the night normally, and gets sore when she stretches like the old times. We're going to start a workout regimen together once we're back on a normal schedule, because my wife tells me I look like hell, even though I've never felt better in my life.
Last night was like any other night. I was switching between listening to music and watching YouTube videos with one headphone in so I could hear my infant daughter if she cries. That way, my wife can get a full night's sleep. When I decided to go lay down in the spare bed in the baby's room. Just as I dozed off, I heard a thumping coming from the front porch. Startled at first, I opened my eyes wide and scanned the room. Realizing it was most likely my cat scratching himself on the front porch, I dozed back off. And then again, the thumping. Damn cat, I thought to myself. I got out of bed to run him off the porch, only to see that he wasn't there anymore. Well, now that I was up again, I wasn't the least bit tired. I figured I'd just get some tea and search Facebook while I'm up, maybe finish the web series I was watching on YouTube. A few minutes into the video, I felt the sudden urge to look up at the kitchen window. There they were. The tops of two short-statured people's heads cresting the stairs just above my window frame. The people were just short enough to not see in the window, but I could see out. I heard no footsteps on my porch as my stomach turned, but the knock was a steady, hollow thump, the very same thump I had just blamed my cat. Deciding it was best not to answer, I shut my laptop and crept by the door back to the baby's room. I assumed it was some of the people from the low-income houses across the road from me that were high or hiding from the cops, or maybe looking for my cousin who stays with me often and has many friends over there. The last thing I needed was to try to explain to two stoners that I was trying to sleep, even though it was 2 a.m. It wasn't until I got to my daughter's room that the creepiness set in. The thump had moved from the kitchen to the bedroom windows, both windows, a room apart, thumping in perfect harmony. These stoners were going to wake up my daughter if they didn't run them off now. Pissed off, I went out of the kitchen, unlocked, and opened the door ready to run around to the side of the house and kick some little idiot's ass. It happened then. Standing there looking at me were two 10 or 11-year-old boys. The feeling of dread and the smell of mold almost made me vomit. The smaller of the two then spoke. "May we use your telegram?" "Huh? I just stared blankly at these boys. Horrified of what I then realized. Their eyes were pitch black. He asked me again to use my telegram. There wasn't a sound to be heard, no crickets chirping, no dogs barking, no cars driving by. Nothing. I tried to play it cool and ignore the fact that he didn't say telephone or phone or cell, anything that would have made any sense of the situation, and calmly replied, "I don't have service at my house. I'm sorry." The expressions on their faces turned to rage as I finished my sentence. Swiftly, I shut the door and locked it as quickly as I could, then stumbled back to protect my daughter. I picked her up from her crib and held her close. The fact that she didn't wake up freaked me out the most, but I managed to gather my senses enough to make sure she was still breathing and warm. Everything seemed okay with her. The thumping on the windows was back. I dropped to the floor as close to the wall as I could and held my little girl in my arms and wept like a child. I felt helpless and afraid. I lied there for what felt like hours and hours, crying and shaking until I heard it. My wife's alarm clock. The thumping stopped the instant the alarm went off, and I crept into the master bedroom with the baby. "What's wrong with you?" my wife asked me. I just had a bad dream, is all I could mutter out. "Okay, well, give me the baby so that I can feed her before work." I handed my wife the baby, and she fed her like any normal day. I turned on every light in the house and made her coffee. For some reason, just having her awake calmed my nerves enough to pretend like nothing happened. I walked her out to the car nervously with the baby in my arms. I asked her not to leave until I went back to the house. She was put off by the request, but did so to humor me. Once I was safely in the house, I locked the door again, and in the house I sat horrified until she got home. I insisted we go to the next town over and stay the weekend at my brother's house, and here I sit horrified while she sleeps in the guest room with my daughter. Wondering why this stopped when the alarm went off. I think I know the answer. I was aware of BEKs, and she wasn't. Every story I've read about them is from someone who already knows about them. Maybe knowledge of them existing is the only reason that they visit. I'm afraid, and I'm sorry.
Well, that was just shit yourself scary. If you want to shit yourself some more, then check out the links in the description to both Viidith22's channel, as well as the other half of this collab, also on his channel. Anyway guys, I'll see you later. And remember, the best things happen in the brothels. Fuck the dark, the brothels, that's where it all goes down. Especially in Amsterdam, those places are just great. Bye.